dad was a Greyhound bus driver, and he loved to fish, and we went blue fishing on the beach a lot. And we would ride the beach in the car and look for other people with their rods stuck in sand spikes, I think they call them. And wherever the most people were, we'd stop and we'd fish for a while and load up on bluefish. And that's where I got my first taste of fishing. And then I started going out fishing on my own, and I would ride my bike to the Palm Beach Spillway, which was the Palm Beach Canal now, and whether the locks were open or not, it was unbelievably good snook fishing there. And there were barges that were sunk and big docks across the canal that I didn't fish on the dock side. I fished on the sloped beach side, basically. And I would cast my Zara spooks all around and always catch snook. I'd always catch them. And it wasn't uncommon for me to be riding my bike back to the house with 2 snook on each side of my handlebars. And I'd ride home, and my dad and mom would be so happy that I caught these fish for dinner. We would drive actually from Lake Worth. I think we made it all the way to Hope Sound sometimes. And the road was so narrow, just, you know, it was a 2-car, 2-lane road. And, you know, the tree growth wasn't as high as it is now. The dune wasn't as high, and you could look down on the beach and see everything that was going on the beach. And so whether it was the mullet run or the bluefish run or the pompano run, you could find out where all the fish were being caught pretty easily by just driving the beach and looking. Sometimes there would be areas where you'd have to walk down a path, and there was lots of access to the beaches. You'd walk down a path and you'd go and look up and down the beach and maybe see something going on about 2 miles down or a mile down the road, and you drive down there real quick and get your tackle out and start fishing. And it was a lot more accessible than it is now by a long ways. We made our own Burma rods. We'd buy this Burma cane from a lot of gas stations used to sell Burma cane for people to make their fishing rods out of. And Marshall's was a big bait tackle store, and it was right on US 1 in Riviera Beach, and everybody would go there and get mullet, dead mullet. And Mr. Marshall was an expert cast netter. He was always a good bait provider, and that would be the first place you'd get mullet wrapped up in newspaper, and then you'd head to the beach and start driving the beach to find out where the fish were. There was always fish, though, it seemed. I was probably about 22, 23, and the Blue Heron, small span of the Little Blue Heron Bridge used to be a great mackerel spot. I think there's a few mackerel around there nowadays, but it used to be elbow to elbow, solid people casting jigs for mackerel. And I know the story you want me to tell. Actually, I had devised a method of catching more than one mackerel on a line, and I had taken 2 spoons and tied them side by side, and I'd make a long cast and I'd bring it in very quickly and catch 2 mackerel. And this one particular time I was getting ready to flip the 2 mackerel over the rail. I felt a hard thump in the back of my head, and I flipped the mackerel in and felt my head. I thought someone had hit me with a sinker, and it was this huge spoon. And as I felt it in my head, all of a sudden it started to jerk, and there was a man about 5 people down that thought his line was hung up on the bridge somewhere, and he was pulling. The line actually was tilting my head sideways, and so I grabbed the line and I pulled it and I bit it with my teeth and cut the line. And I went over to the guy and I said, "Here's your spoon, buddy." And so wanted to fish more because it really didn't hurt that badly, but it was just kind of cumbersome. But I had to go to the hospital to have it cut out. And unfortunately, my wife worked at that same hospital, and when I went to the ER, they called her up on the floor she worked on and had her come down. I was not really supposed to be fishing that day. Easily there would be 200 people, and people behind people waiting for someone to bring a fish over the rail where they could be putting their fish away, and then the guy would step away from the rail and another person would take that spot. It was crazy. But there were hundreds of mackerel being caught every day. It was very chaotic, yeah. I mean, there were people with tangled lines and cursing and yelling, and people were, they were just being people that are upset with one another half the time, but it was actually a lot of fun. It was an outgoing tide, and it was during the April migration back to the north, April, May, I would say, and the word got out pretty quickly about the mackerel run. A lot of mates used to go there and catch mackerel and save them and put them on the ice right away for blue marlin fishing, and they would sell them to their boats that they worked on or sell them to bait stores or whatever, but the mackerel were the prime size for blue marlin trolling, and a lot of the mates did that. I waited with my dad a lot. We would park the car, and there was a spit of land that separated, I think it was Little Lake Worth and the Munyon Island area. It was all grass flats in there, and we would plug cast, go on a high tide, and just wade and just walk and wade at the same time, and we would catch redfish, trout, snook. Every once in a while we'd skip a pompano, and very few times we went in there and targeted pompano with a jig and a flea on it at the same time, and we caught a few pompano that way. But it was a pretty good area for catching snook, trout, redfish. All grass. There's not that much grass there now. It's a lot taken over by algae, but it was great fishing back then. The area that is now sugar sands and all, that was all filled in from the lake. They pumped all that sand in and then made dry land out of it and put houses on it. But that was all just a big cove we always called it just the lake, Lake Worth. And all that area was just great fishing. And there was always mullet there, always. And we would sometimes fish live mullet there and get our croaker sacks, which are basically burlap bags with they were potato bags, and those were our bait wells. We carry a croaker sack tied to a rope on our waist and with live mullet in it, and they kept the mullet fine. I mean, they were good baits at the time, and so we kept them in there. The bridge that went over the Ermine River by the Pancake House was a favorite snook fishing spot of mine. My friend David Mann and I got the idea to fish under the bridge. We'd fished on top of the bridge and lost a lot of snook, and we were fishing way too light a line, and there was always mullet coming through there. March, April was the good mullet run, silver mullet run, and we would net mullet up on the bridge and then put them in our bait pens that we hung from the bridge. Well, as we fished on the bridge, we didn't do well snook fishing, and we heard the snook eating, striking the mullet under the bridge all the time. It was constant. And the bridge was actually too big to drift your mullet back underneath because it was a 4-lane road at the time. So we decided that we'd fish under the bridge. Well, the water under the bridge was actually too deep where the access to the snook were. So we took rocks that they had put around the bridge, and we made elevated platforms to fish on out in the middle of the pilings, in the middle of the bridge. And as the mullet would come through, of course we'd have a live mullet on, and we'd throw it upstream and it would drift down. Then we'd reel it along the pilings, and the snook would just inhale the mullet. And funny thing about the boat traffic, one time we would get upset when these boats would come through thinking that they would scare the fish. So one time as the boat went through, we threw a bait right in the wake of the boat, and we got an instant bite. And so after that we prayed for boats to come through, because for some reason it excited the snook and caused them to eat pretty well. We all got pulled in the water. That was common. On a really high tide, you're so buoyant that even a 10, 15 pound snook could pull you in the water. And we didn't use a light line after we lost so many fish. We'd always use 80 to 100 pound test. So, you know, there wasn't much give on the line. And so if you were slightly buoyant, you got pulled in. And of course, you just kind of paddled around, and you went through the pilings when the snook went through, and you hardly ever lost a snook if you hooked them, because you were always right there where they were. And then you just swam to shore and dragged your snook up on the beach. I worked on a 42-foot Daytona boat with a guy by the name of Tom Furtado, the captain. He worked for Ted Nafsker and Steve Sloan. They were the two owners of this boat. And it was a great little boat. I went to Mexico several times on the boat from Key West, and not a really nice trip. Very, very rough. No autopilot. Everybody steered the boat. They took watches and steered the boat, and it was brutal. Never had a nice crossing. But one of the funniest stories I remember was we were fishing the Masters Sailfish Tournament, and Steve Sloan and Sam Everett, I think both of these guys are passed away now, but Sam Everett was very detail oriented. He made his own reels. He didn't make his reels, but he engineered different gears for his reels and such, and he was really a detailed guy. Anyway, he gave us explicit instructions on how to rig his swimming, split-tailed finger mullet. I mean, all this stuff done to a little finger mullet. And so he said, I don't want any weights, no weights on my bait. Everybody, just a naked bait with a hook in it and mono-leader, and that's it. And so Tom and I kind of devised this plan to ruffle his feathers a little bit. At the start of the fishing day, the angler stands next to his side of the boat with his rod in his hand, ready to let the line out. And when the bell goes off, so to speak, the time starts for the fishing tournament. The mate puts the bait in the water, and then the angler lets the line out. Well, on the very first day, Sam Everett was on our boat, and Tom and I decided to put an 8-ounce tuna weight on the chin of this 5-inch swimming finger mullet. And as soon as I dropped the bait over with the heavy sinker on it, Sam Everett goes, I said no lead! And he was so angry. And of course I had another bait ready to clip on to his line, but he lost it temporarily. Then at the end of the day, when he stepped on the dock, he looked over and he said, that was pretty funny. He never did laugh though, but he just said, that was pretty funny. The Masters is a compilation of supposedly all the best anglers in the world. In most cases, it's the wealthiest anglers in the world who have the best and fastest boats and best crews. But it was a tournament designed to basically crown the best sail fisherman around, so to speak, in the world possibly. But it wasn't held in other locations like it is now. It was all held out of Palm Beach Inlet and out of the Sailfish Club docks. And so when fishing started to slow a little bit here, they moved it to Mexico and Isla Mujeres and such. I would say John Rybovich started it, yeah. And it was a good place to showcase his boats too. You can talk about early charter boats. Some were pretty sparsely designed compared to charter boats now. The towers didn't have controls in them. At first they didn't have towers. The outriggers used to be made out of Burma cane, never aluminum or any of this. Basically they're just very sparse boats that had a big cockpit, and people did a lot of chartering out of Palm Beach. And my little boat that my dad and I had was a 14-foot aluminum Orlando Clipper with a 90-horse Mercury on it that worked half the time. But we would go offshore, and offshore to us was between the red buoy and the green buoy, and we catch sails, kingfish, big kingfish, amberjacks. Everything was in close there. I remember one day I was out with my dad, and we had caught live blue runners right at the end of the South Jetty, and we had them in a bucket. We'd bail water into the bucket to keep the live bait alive, and then fish these blue runners, and we caught big smoker kings, 20, 30 pounders, sailfish just offshore the jetty. It was amazing how many fish were around then. Honestly, this drift boat across the street used to be actually the worst one in the fleet. The Blue Heron was the best, owned by Ted Brower. And my dad went out on that king fishing once in a while. We had a spot that we would go and rent boats out of, and it was called Layton's Park. It was a big trailer park, and right at where the Port of Palm Beach is now, they had a docking area where they would bring boats to people who had their own outboard motors, and you would put your own motor on and motor away and go fishing. And they would bring these boats down on a rail, an overhead rail, with a chain on the boat or a rope, and it would pull the boat. They were stacked in bays, 3 or 4 boats high, maybe 20 boats wide. And they would put these boats on some kind of a harness and tow them on a rail out to the water and then drop them in the water. I forget whether it was a pulley system. I'm sure it was a pulley system. They would do like a block and tackle and drop it in the water, and then you'd pull it over to the dock, and I would hold the boat to the dock, and my dad would come with his 15-horse Johnson, step on the boat, and then put it on the transom and screw the wing nuts with the clamps onto the transom of the boat. And then he'd pull it and start it, and then we'd go off fishing. And we'd catch mackerel, pompano, and bluefish. And sometimes the fishing was just so fierce, and lures weren't quite as available as they are nowadays. And if we lost terminal tackle, I can remember my dad sometimes just taking a hook, tying it on the line, and cutting a piece of his t-shirt and putting it on the hook and drop it back and trolling and catching bluefish and mackerel that way. And we'd have no lures left, and that's what we would end up using to catch fish with, to catch mackerel with bluefish. There were all kinds of people. I mean, it was It was a busy place. Like it was, Layton's was the hub right then of the fishing activity at that time. It was pretty wild. Then another place sprung up, which is now Sailfish Marina. It used to be called Bill's Marina, and a guy by the name of Bill Backstedt owned it and ran it, and he would rent boats. They were all orange boats. Couldn't go out in the ocean in these boats because they were all little flat-bottom skiffs, but they also would let you put your motors on those boats and run them. Something I forgot to mention about Layton Stocks. They also rented inboard boats, and these little boats were wood flatties, and they had lawnmower engines in them. And I'm sure these were like some of the first four-stroke engines that were in boats, because they had a little shaft and a little propeller, and the motors would always run, and they would put them in and out of gear with a gear shift, and then they'd steer with a tiller in the back. And some of the best pompano fishermen used to use these boats, and they would go rent the boats at Layton's and fish for pompano out of them. Fish houses were around because there were a lot of fish to handle, and the fish houses like Hudgens and Acme and Pinder's used to have all commercial fishermen fishing for them, and they would bring in their catches, and at the end of the fishing periods, as you fishermen know, that fish bite certain periods of time and then they quit. Well, for instance, the kingfishermen used to be all lined up in the intercoastal, in the we called Lake Worth, waiting to bring their catches in to be unloaded and counted, and you got a ticket for your fish, and then you got paid every month. And there would be 20, 30 boats in the lake waiting to be serviced by the fish house, bringing their catch in and weighed and all that. And it was a kind of a interesting thing to see. There's just lots of fish being handled at these fish houses. There was one fish house that was actually very close to the West Palm Beach Fishing Club, Hudgens. I want to say it was on the other side, wasn't it? On the other side of the bridge here. That was one of the biggest fish houses in the area, Hudgens. And then Acme Seafood, which was probably halfway to the Blue Heron Bridge on the west side. And then Pinder's was just across from Acme. And they would supply their fishermen with ice before they went fishing, and then get their fish in the afternoon when they came in from fishing. I knew Annie, and I was actually a junior jetty conch, fishing snook on the jetty when the mullet run occurred. That was another crazy time when you could catch almost as many snook as you wanted, as big as you wanted. There was a consortium of anglers like you wouldn't believe. There were people in the appraisal business, lawyers, judges, and then there were painters and yard people, and I mean, it was a huge collection of mismatched people, if you would, but they all had this common bond of the mullet run, and they loved each other, but they never saw each other in between the mullet run and when the next mullet run occurred. It was just, that's the only time they got together. But that was a fun time. Nobody wanted people walking through their yards to get to the beach, and Jim Branch had the only access, and we had to use his beach access to get to the inlet. He was very very nice about it.